It's been 8 months since I last did a video on the Wars of the Roses, so I thought it's finally time I get this topic squared away. The afternoon sun rose high over the field of Bosworth as the din of battle died down. King Richard III was dead, struck several times in the skull, the first English king to die in battle on English soil since Harold Godwinson 400 years prior. He may have died fighting, but it was not a glorious end. After the battle, his corpse was stripped naked by a few soldiers, humiliated, stabbed in the arse, and thrown in a shallow grave. Henry Tudor, meanwhile, offered his thanks to God and addressed his troops. Thomas Stanley found a blood-stained crown and placed it upon the new king's head. The king was dead. Long live the king. After organising his forces, he began a slow crawl to London. With Richard III dead, Henry wasn't in such a rush. Besides, the summer of 1485 saw London beset with disease, so Henry was forced to hang back while he planned his coronation. While he was not exactly an event planner, Henry knew one thing about his coronation: it would have to be big, expensive and grandiose. But this went beyond simple extravagance or post-victory giddiness. Such displays of majesty were not only appreciated, but necessary. The King of England was 27 years old, had spent 16 of those years in exile, and was politically unknown to most in the country. In short, if Henry wished to convince the people that he was their king, he would have to do it loudly, and with as many bells and whistles as possible. He certainly didn't disappoint, splurging £1,500 on the coronation and lighting up London with mirth and merriment. He also made sure to date his reign from the day before the Battle of Bosworth, signifying how his reign was divinely ordained. He dished out rewards to his supporters, including his own mother, who was given several estates to rule in her own right, and then prepared for his marriage to Elizabeth of York. As the daughter of Edward IV, she was key in getting former Yorkists on side and reinforced his legitimacy. Nevertheless, he made sure only to marry her after his coronation to show that he was ruling through his own right. This marriage was then followed up by a masterclass in propaganda and graphic design. The White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster were married together to form the iconic Tudor Rose, which still sits on Britain's royal crest to this day. Simple and elegant, even the most illiterate mud-eating peasant could see what was up and know that a new age was dawning. Two families bonded in marriage, bringing an end to decades of bloodshed and suffering. A nice story, but not strictly true. Firstly, the Wars of the Roses had not yet ended, and this episode will outline the final conclusion of the dynastic struggles that had engulfed England for the past few decades. Secondly, Henry's claim to the Lancastrian cause was tenuous at best, and thirdly, the Lancastrian rose was only used infrequently prior to this occasion. You see, roses were a fairly common aristocratic symbol in the Middle Ages, and while the Yorkists had made frequent use of the white rose as their symbol, the Red Rose of Lancaster was not frequently used until the reign of the Tudors. Henry used it primarily as a way to reinforce the concept of the Tudor claim to the throne, perfectly showcasing the Tudors as a divinely ordained family of rulers who inherited the Lancastrian claim, even though Henry's blood claim to the Lancastrian cause was fairly weak. The overwhelming force of Henry's propaganda, however, led to many works of art being flooded with red roses, sometimes going as far as to modify old books, and retroactively lump the Lancastrians firmly with the red rose, thus enabling this tidy reading of history to become adopted by the masses. These are the Wars of the Roses after all. The Wars of the Roses were not ended by the peaceful marrying of two roses. No, instead it was the merciless Darwinistic chopping of any other rose who grew too close. By 1485, there were barely any people with a claim to the throne left, but that didn't mean that the few left were scared to try their hand. Henry had taken the crown, but hanging onto it was another matter entirely, and the extravagance of his coronation belies Henry's insecurity on the throne. He still had foes, and soon he found himself fighting frauds and impostors. For in 1487 Henry was faced with the rebellion of someone claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, son of George, Duke of Clarence, and therefore nephew to Edward IV. The boy in question, a carpenter's son by the name of Lambert Simnel, was crowned as Edward VI in Dublin at age 10. His supporters included John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, another nephew of Richard III and Edward IV, while Simnel also found support further afield from Margaret of Burgundy, Richard III's sister and the Tudor regime's staunchest opponent. An issue facing Simnel was the fact that the real Edward Earl of Warwick was currently rotting in the Tower of London, but the rebels clung on to their convenient lie, and an alarming amount of support began to gather at Simnel's back. The storm finally broke in 1487, when Simnel and John de la Pole invaded England with several thousand men. The alarm bells rang out, and Henry marched to defend his crown he had so recently won. Soon he had gathered a force greater than Simnel's, but Henry took no chances. As a usurper himself, he understood that fortune was a fickle beast, and marched north in person to crush the rebels, bringing 12,000 men to bear against John de la Pole's 8,000. They met in battle near the village of Stoke. The fighting was fierce, and many men fell on both sides, but the weight of Henry's numbers soon crushed the rebel lines, and they eventually fled the king. 4,000 rebels had been killed, John de la Pole and several other high-ranking Yorkists among them. Lambert Simnel was brought to the Tower of London, but Henry treated him chivalrously, and he would live out the rest of his life in peace in service of the king. Henry had successfully defended his crown, and the Battle of Stoke would prove to be the last he would ever need to fight, but he wasn't out of the woods yet. Just as he had neutralised one threat to his power, another usurper sprang from the shadows. Henry VI was soon fighting ghosts, and I mean that quite literally. In 1491, a dead man, or to be more precise a dead boy, had seemingly come back to life, when someone claiming to be Richard, one of the princes in the tower, suddenly popped up. It was common knowledge that King Richard III had killed this younger Richard in 1485, but no corpse had ever been found. This time the man behind the mask was one Perkin Warbeck. Born in northern France in 1474, he would have been the same age as Richard had he been alive. He was also said to have courtly grace and the ability to speak multiple languages. Prior to the conspiracy, he had been working on a merchant ship and only washed up in Ireland due to a bad storm, but the rocky crags of Ireland proved to be the natural breeding ground for disaffected Yorkists, and after arriving he came to the attention of several Yorkist sympathisers. 6 years on from Bosworth, they may have been feeling desperate, because I doubt any of these men believed that he was the real deal, but it was a convenient lie, so they went along with it. Warbeck then went on a tour of Europe, setting himself up at the court of anyone who wished to get one over on Henry VII. His first stop was the court of Charles VIII of France, who was always happy to prod the English king for any signs of weakness. Henry, however, did not enjoy being prodded, and treated Warbeck's presence in Paris as a hostile act, invading France in 1492 with as many as 15,000 men. Charles liked the idea of being able to prod Henry with the possession of Warbeck, but now he was getting far more than he bargained for. Therefore, the two monarchs came to an agreement in the Treaty of Etaples. Henry agreed to withdraw from France, and in return Charles paid a large war indemnity, along with 50,000 gold crowns annually for 15 years. Furthermore, he would no longer support Warbeck's claim, so the impostor was sent packing and left for the court of his supposed aunt, Margaret of Burgundy. Margaret was a ruthless politician and Henry's most intractable enemy on the continent, and the fact that she entertained Warbeck at court, knowing full well that he was not her nephew, is a mark of that. She sent out clandestine agents to seek out those who would be predisposed to a new king, and the threat to Henry's throne became graver and graver with every passing month. Eventually he got word of several high-ranking noblemen among the cabal, and went into a state of emergency, flooding the continent with spies, peddling propaganda at every corner, and placing ports under heavy surveillance. Henry's fifth columnist struck gold when one of the conspirators turned coat, and Henry was able to pump him for vast amounts of info. Most shocking among the findings was the revelation that William Stanley, the man whose decisive charge had killed Richard III and saved Henry's life at Bosworth, would not oppose Warbeck's invasion. It was a shock, but Henry acted decisively nonetheless, and William Stanley was summarily executed in 1495, along with a few other noblemen. With Margaret's support, Warbeck tried his hand at invading both Kent and Ireland, but both were repulsed by Henry's improved defences, so he fled to King James IV of Scotland, where the Scottish king, much like the French one, was all too happy to have a tool against the English. James IV eagerly led an invasion of northern England in 1496, but the campaign never amounted to much, and public support for Warbeck's claim was non-existent. James therefore withdrew north, but Henry would not let his attacks go unpunished, and induced Parliament to levy large taxes across the realm to fund an invasion of Scotland. Fortunately for James, the harsh taxes triggered a rebellion in Cornwall, which Henry was forced to crush instead. But Henry's decisive response convinced James that Warbeck was more of a liability than an advantage, so he was sent on his merry way for the last time. Feeling the pinch, he decided upon one last throw of the dice, and landed in Cornwall in an attempt to rouse the rebellious spirit of the past few months. It didn't go well, and royal troops were soon on the march, and Warbeck's hopes were dashed for one last time. He was brought to the Tower of London, and, like Lambert Simnel, was treated honourably and allowed to work in the king's service. Unlike Simnel, however, Warbeck didn't have the good sense to keep his head down, and was imprisoned in 1498 after attempting to escape the royal court. He attempted to escape the Tower in 1499, but was captured once again and executed. Another claimant to the crown had been snuffed out, and nearly all the strands of royal descent had been gutted during the wars. But, as we shall see, Henry just couldn't seem to catch a break. But we must briefly step back from the action to see what was happening in the Tudor dynasty itself. Henry's first son, Arthur, was born not long after his marriage in 1486, followed by Margaret in 1489, and then another Henry in 1491. The couple would have other children after that, but they don't really concern us. While he was busy dealing with frauds and usurpers throughout the 1480s and 90s, he was also assiduously working away at forging continental alliances. The high watermark of this policy was the betrothal of Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. This secured for Henry a very advantageous marriage with the powerful rulers of Spain, and when Catherine and Arthur were finally married in 1501, it was one of the happiest days of his life. Sadly, it wouldn't last. Henry was delivered a miserable 1-2 punch by fate when Prince Arthur died of either cancer or tuberculosis in 1502 at age 15, followed by Queen Elizabeth in 1503 at age 37. The impact of this was immediate and all-consuming. Henry sank into paranoia and a depression from which he would never fully rise. From now on, he would be far colder and saw enemies in every shadow. Towards the end of his reign, the mistrust would become mutual, and he became generally despised by the time of his death in 1509. Henry's final challenge would come from the De la Pole family, one of the final families in England with any driblet of royal blood inside them. Now, if you remember correctly, John de la Pole was one of the rebels who supported Lambert Simnel's claim to the throne, before being killed at the Battle of Stoke. John had 3 brothers, Edmund, William and Richard, which Henry had decided not to punish on account of his treachery, but now they began to squirm under King Henry's icy gaze. Adding to his discontent were the chronic financial issues that beset Edmund de la Pole, who eventually left England in 1496 to speak with notable Yorkists on the continent. This resulted in a diplomatic incident until Henry secured his return. Afterwards, Edmund was slapped with a hefty fine, further slaughtering his finances. It finally became too much, when in 1501 Edmund fled England once again, this time with his youngest brother Richard in tow. The de la Poles fled first to the court of Margaret of Burgundy, but when she died in 1503, they moved to the court of Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor. Soon enough, Edmund, as the son of Richard III's sister Elizabeth, was being hailed as the White Rose, an ominous portent for Henry if there ever was one. William de la Pole, meanwhile, was thrown into the Tower of London, his sole crime being related to 2 traitors, where he would live out the rest of his days. Other people suspected of connection to the de la Poles were imprisoned or executed. Henry was eventually able to exert enough diplomatic pressure on Maximilian to end his support for the de la Poles, but was unable to get them extradited back to England. After a failed assassination attempt on them in 1504, he was left in a bit of a quagmire on how to retrieve the de la Poles, who by now were in a sorry state. Richard was imprisoned in Aachen due to his debts, while Edmund was reduced to wandering the Netherlands, a stone's throw from poverty. Eventually he wound up in the custody of Philip the Fair, son of Maximilian, and decided that he'd had enough of exile, but his hopes of getting home were realised far sooner than he had expected. In January 1506, Henry had a sudden stroke of luck. Philip the Fair was sailing to Spain when one of the worst storms to hit northern Europe swept up his ship and dumped him on the English coast. The Duke was now effectively Henry's prisoner. A treaty was soon agreed between the miserable Duke and the smug King, in which Philip agreed to a series of unfair trade concessions and promised to hand over Edmund. It was the end of the line for the White Rose, who was handed over and thrown into the Tower of London, where he would live until his execution in 1503. 1 rose had been plucked, 1 to go. Richard de la Pole escaped captivity in Aachen in 1506, and embarked upon the well-worn path for English claimants, tramping around the courts of Europe, looking for a sponsor to send him home with an army. He adopted the name of the White Rose, eventually turned up in France, and nearly invaded England in 1513 with an army of 12,000, but peace between England and France ended the attempt. Nevertheless, Richard stayed at the French court, where the new King Francis I would cause much distress in England, as several invasions were rumoured, but none ever came. The tale of the White Rose would not end in England. Instead, far away across the Alps, Richard fought for Francis at the bloody Battle of Pavia. The French were eventually routed by the Habsburgs, and of the 20,000 French troops on the field, 8,000 were killed. Among the dead was Richard de la Pole, the White Rose, grandson of Richard, Duke of York, The White Rose was one of the last people with any real claim to the English throne, but now that his corpse was fertilising an Italian field, the Tudor regime could take a sigh of relief. Those few nobles with even a scratch of royalty in their veins were too timid to muster up any opposition, and England's blessings didn't end there though, as the nation now possessed something that it hadn't seen for nearly a century. In 1509, Henry VII died and the throne passed to Henry VIII, the first monarch in a long time to be both born to a ruling king and to be capable, vigorous and decisive. For the first time in a long time, England was getting a taste of competent, fully legitimate kingship, and Henry VIII was able to direct the nation with such power and panache as to quell any opposition to his rule. Today, Henry VIII has an infamous reputation, but he nevertheless left nobody in any doubt as to who was running the shop. The Wars of the Roses were truly over. By contrast, Henry VII has faded somewhat in the popular imagination when compared to his far more memorable son. Memorable for all the wrong reasons, but memorable nonetheless. He was not a bad king, and brought stability to a land previously rendered by war, although near the end of his reign he descended into despotic darkness. His innate talent for propaganda enhanced the legitimacy of what otherwise would have been a usurping dynasty, and smoothed the path for the Tudor regime. He successfully kept many usurpers and frauds at bay, restoring a degree of stability to his country. He was not the next to Edward III or Henry V, and he was not always a good king, but he brought with him some peace and quiet. And you could be forgiven for thinking that, in an age of bloodshed and violence, rape and ruin, savagery and chaos, triumph and tragedy, maybe a bit of peace and quiet wasn't such a bad thing.